Are you going out of your mind trying to figure out the best tipping policy for your restaurant? Stick around. I got you. Hey now, Dave Allred, the Real Barman here from barpatrol.net. Today's topic is one of the hottest topics for bar and restaurant owners and managers, mainly because no matter what tipping policy you come up with, someone's always going to be unhappy. All right, this is not uncommon in our industry. Nobody bitches or moans more than bar and restaurant industry employees, and I can say that because I'm one of them. So I'm going to help you out with this today, but first, if you're still looking for the perfect inventory management system for your bar and restaurant, make sure to check us out at barpatrol.net for the fastest, easiest, most accurate, and affordable way to count your inventory. And if you're interested, come join our bar and restaurant owners and managers mastermind Facebook group, where owners and managers just like you come to communicate, collaborate, and connect, as well as share and ask advice from others. You can find both of those links below this video in the comments. With that said, let's jump into the fire. Today I'm going to give you a little tip splitting / tip pooling training, what you can do, what you can't do, as well as what your options are. The main problem is this policy is not standardized in our industry. The tipping policies are all over the place. Everyone's doing something different. And like I said, there's hardly ever an instance in which everyone agrees it's fair. With that said, I'm going to give you my system that I think is simplest and works best, but that by no means makes it law. Okay, these tipping policies vary so widely depending on your restaurant, how busy you are, how much staff you have on, what state you live in. So you need to adjust accordingly and do what's best for you and your restaurant. The other thing to consider is if you're opening a restaurant from scratch, you can absolutely implement any policy you want because it's your restaurant, and when you hire people, they have to adhere to your rules or you won't hire them. Okay, but when you already have a policy in place, you're going to hit a lot more friction from your staff if you're making a big change. Let's start with the tip credit. All right, perhaps you already know what this is or you're already practicing it yourself, but under federal law, some states allow restaurants to take what is called a tip credit against the minimum wage of their state. Minimum wage, easy for me to say. Okay, let's look at an example. All right, the national minimum wage is $5.15 per hour. In most states it's more, but we'll use this as our example. In states that allow a tip credit, the employer can pay a cash wage of at least $2.12 per hour as long as the employee earns enough tips to meet or exceed that $5.15 per hour minimum wage, which would be $3.03 per hour in tips in this example. All right, that's math. Make sense? I hope so, but you'll want to make sure to check your state and see if a tip credit's allowed, as it's going to save you a lot on labor. And in fact, once we get into tip pooling, if you get multiple employees on that tip credit, it's going to save you a lot on labor. Just have to make sure they're exceeding the minimum wage. Now, this may seem obvious, but only employees that make tips can participate in the tip credit. This tip out method is the most traditional method that bars and restaurants have used over the years, and the one that I'm most comfortable with, but of course I'm a bit biased because I used to be a bartender. So in the traditional tip out structures, servers and bartenders bring in the tips, and then they tip out the other job positions that help them out. Okay, so the hierarchy looks like this. At the top of the heap, we have the bartenders, the most coveted position in the hospitality industry. We also have the servers. Now the servers here are placed just a little bit below the bartenders. I actually know servers and cocktail servers that can make more than bartenders, but as a general rule, bartenders are the head of the heap, servers are just barely below them, but both of these positions bring in the tips and the money. Now I know there's other supporting positions that also help in the customer service and bringing in tips, but these are the only two positions that actually ring in sales. So all of that money flows down to the rest of the supporting cast. The supporting cast are people like bussers, barbacks, hosts and hostesses, and food runners. Okay, and we have to disperse tips all the way down. Now, let's get rid of the money here. As a general rule, I like servers to tip out the bar around 10 to 15% of bar sales. Now, people do this differently, and some restaurants I know will say tip out the bartenders 5% of your total sales, but I just don't think that servers should be tipping out on food sales to the bartenders, even though I was a former bartender. It's not fair for a server to ring in $1,000 of food during lunch and $20 at the bar and tip out on all those food sales. The bartender had nothing to do with those food sales, so only tip out on bar sales. With that said, I know some places tipping out 5% of bar sales, which is just too low. I think 15% is a good number. You can make adjustments as you want. So 10 to 15%. Let's look at an example of what happens if you do 5% tip example. Okay, so let's say that the bar, you have $1,000 in bar sales as a server at the end of the night. And let's say that your average drink that you rang in was $7. You might have some beers for $3. You might have some cocktails for $10. Let's say that the average drink is $7. Well, that means that the bartender has to make 143 drinks for you to disperse to your customers, and you only made $5. So 5% to me is just a little too low. I like 15%. You're gonna have to determine what's best for you and your bar. Okay, so 10 to 15% of bar sales there. Servers, I believe, should tip 15% of total tips to their busser. All right. Bartenders should do 15 to 20% of total tips to their barbacks, somewhere in the same ballpark. I just feel like barbacks end up working a lot harder, but this is not always the case. Same with bussers. You could do 15 to 20% to the bussers, just kind of depending on how hard they work and how much they are responsible for helping out with the tipping and the customer service and all that. How much do they deserve? As a general rule, hosts and hostesses do not make money on tips, but we can do a mini tip pool, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then food runners really do vary. I'm thinking 3 to 5% of your food sales go to the food runners, but it really depends on how hard they work. Like 25 years ago, I worked at a claim jumper where it was packed every night. The food runner was working his butt off. It was 2-hour waits. The plates were heavy with big portions, and they were making like $120 a night. So it really depends on your restaurant, but tip your food runners out something. So now let's get rid of this and talk quickly about the mini tip pool I was mentioning earlier. And it will include hosts and sometimes food runners or any position that isn't traditionally tipped. Okay, and so you can have the bartenders and servers tip out something like 5 to 10% on total sales to these positions, and then you can split it up between those positions and they'll make a little bit of extra cash and extra money, makes them feel good. That's like a little mini tip pool. So you can go traditional, tip out your other people, and then split some tips among the non-customary positions. Does that make sense? Now, what about managers? Can managers participate in a tip pool or any tipping at all? Or what about the kitchen staff? What about them? Well, owners and managers, never. They cannot participate. This is against the law. They cannot take any tips. Kitchen staff cannot if you're participating in a tip credit. However, if you are not participating in a tip credit, they can take tips and participate in the tip pool, which is why this guy's like, yes! Woo! Okay, does all that make sense? I hope it does. Let's talk quickly about a giant tip pool. Now, tip pooling is defined as taking the collective amount of tips brought in by the servers and bartenders and splitting them evenly by work group usually, so that everyone involved gets compensated for their work with tips. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of putting a tip pooling policy into place? Let's take a look. So these are reasons for the tip pool. All right, first, distributing tips to more employees means that in states where it is allowed, owners can take advantage of the tip credit we talked about earlier. This saves you a ton of money on labor. So if you can do it and you can get everyone involved, make sure they're making over minimum wage, I recommend it. It forms a teamwork mentality and therefore service is better. Everyone's involved, everyone's working as a team, everyone's making the same tips, so we all want to help each other out. When everyone's receiving tips, everyone's happy, which results in less turnover. Okay, well, let's talk about the reasons to not do a tip pool or the disadvantages of it. Tip pooling can cause anger among staff members used to traditional tipping methods, which can also cause turnover. Right? We talked about this earlier. If you already have a system in place and you try to do a big change, this is going to cause a lot of anger. You might lose employees who leave. You're going to have to decide if that's worth it. Next, stronger employees bringing in more tips but being paid less because of others' lack of production can cause for disgruntled employees. And this is a big one for me. I don't think strong employees should be punished because other people aren't doing their job. And when everything's equal, that's just not fair to the stronger employees. And then lastly, putting in a new system like this can be a monstrous task with unpredictable results. Okay? Now remember, if you're in a state that allows a tip credit, you must make sure everyone is making over minimum wage by receiving enough tips from the tip pool. I just talked about this. You don't want to get in trouble with the law. In addition, federal law allows mandatory tip pooling, but in some states it is prohibited, which overrides the federal law, so you want to make sure to check your state laws. All right, so if you encourage or require a tip pool, you need to make sure it's legal to do so in your state. Tip pooling in some states only allow it to be done voluntarily by the staff. Okay, so let's bring back all of our positions. We've got the bartenders, the servers, the bussers, the barbacks, the hosts and hostesses, the food runners, and even the chef. This is all involved in a tip pool in which we are going to share all of this money collectively. Now, something you need to remember, the more people you include in the tip pool, the less everyone's going to make. Okay, which like I said, can anger some people. So if you have a big kitchen staff, that's going to be a lot more people and less money for everyone. All right, so the two questions you need to ask are, one, who's going to be included or excluded from the tip pool? And then how will the tips be distributed among the different work groups? You need a percentage breakdown. All right. Also, don't forget that if you're going to implement a tip pool, that you as a manager or owner need to maintain precise records of the amount of tips reported and how much was tipped out to each person. All right, in case you ever get audited. Now, I'm going to give you a tip pooling distribution sort of outline here. Okay, this is just a ballpark to give you a starting point, and then you can adjust. This will at least give you an idea. So let's say that $1,000 of tips came in during the night. Well, the bartenders should get right around 35%. The servers, 24%. And the reason I put 24 instead of 25 is because of the math that's going to come down below. I'm going to tip the bottom part, the equal amounts, and it all works out to 100%. The bussers and barbacks around 12%, and then the whole bottom crew, the food runners, the kitchen staff, and the hostesses, 5% each. Okay, does that make sense? That should at least give you a starting point. Now, you as the manager is responsible for collecting all the tips and distributing them either after the shift or the next day. You can put them in little envelopes and they can pick them up later, which also causes extra work for you, right? You got to distribute all the tips. People come in during their days off. You got to go to the safe. You got to get them out. So the tip pool is a lot of work. But once again, if you're in a tip credit, it could work to your advantage. All right, now let's talk about the hourly tip breakdown. Now, most of you already know what an hourly tip breakdown is. It's basically how to disperse the tips within a work group, and they all work separate hours. So you have 3 bartenders, they all work beyond the bar, they bring in the tips. How do we tip out each bartender based on how many hours they work? It's very simple, but if you're a beginner, I want to show you really quick, just because this is an all-inclusive training on the tip methods. So let's just go over a quick example so you can see how this works. This is the hourly tip breakdown. Let's say that we have 3 bartenders, like I just said, and let's say that bartender A works 8 hours, bartender B 6 hours, and bartender C works 4 hours. And let's say that they brought in $700 during the night. Well, here's the formula. All right, hourly equals the total tips brought in divided by the total hours worked between the 3 bartenders. All right, so the income is going to be the hourly that we determine times the hour worked for each individual bartender. All right, so the hourly is the total hours, which is 18 hours in this example, divided. The total tips are 700, so we're going to take 700 and divide by 18 hours, and the hourly is going to be 38.9. That's how much they are going to make per hour. So their income is going to be bartender A worked 8 hours times 38.9. He makes 311. Bartender B makes 233, and bartender C makes 156. All right, does all that make sense? It's very simple math, but if you're not sure how to do this, there it is. There's the formula for you. So finally, to finish this thing up, let's talk about the no tipping policy. What is the no tipping policy? Well, in 2015, Danny Meyers of the Union Square Hospitality Group decided to eliminate tipping in all of his restaurants. He believed it was a discriminatory practice and created inequality among the workers, and that a no tipping policy was fair for everyone. Now, you're welcome to have whatever opinion you want about this, but I am in total disagreement with Mr. Meyers on this. I understand that some workers are at the bottom of the totem pole and get paid less, but I'm not sure why he thinks the restaurant industry is different than, say, a traditional corporation in which you have a hierarchy of power and salary. All right, to me, this is like a secretary suddenly demanding that she make the same salary as the CEO. I know that might sound harsh to the bleeding hearts out there, but again, if you want a more coveted position that makes more money, I say you work your way up to busser, barback, server, bartender. Don't just expect that you're owed money because you want it to be fair. All right, Danny Meyers' system is more closely aligned to a philosophy similar to someone else you may have heard of. Yep, this guy, Karl Marx, the father of socialism, equality for all despite talent or hard work or whatever position you've earned. All right, now I'm not going to turn this into a political debate. I'm not even that political at all. But one thing I strongly believe in is if you work and rise and earn a coveted position that you've been seeking out and you get that position, you shouldn't be penalized so everyone else can share in what you earned. All right, if you don't like that hosts don't make tips, then you should work toward becoming a server. Don't sit and moan about how unfair life is. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all about helping out the underdog and people who need it, but I'm not about penalizing those who have earned their spot because they were resourceful enough, hardworking enough, and smart enough to find a way to get there. That's just my 2 cents. You can believe whatever you want. That's why it's great to live here. You can voice your opinion. All right. With that said, just a few months ago here in 2020, Danny Meyer and those others practicing the no tipping policy announced that they would be getting rid of it as it was too complicated to implement and it simply wasn't working. All right, servers and bartenders weren't happy at all and they quit to go work elsewhere. The turnover went way up and less talented people were being hired to provide service that wasn't very good service at all. So I don't recommend the no tipping policy whatsoever unless you want a riot on your hands or at the very least a very inexperienced and talentless waitstaff. So that's my 2 cents on that. I hope this helps some. I know this was a long training video, but this is a complicated concept depending on your restaurant dynamics and which state you live in. And because of that, unfortunately, I can't tell you what to do. You're going to have to take the information I provided, sit down with your managers and maybe even some of your staff members in order to hopefully put in a tipping policy that will make everyone as happy as they can be. It's not going to be perfect. With that said, I'm done here. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Check us out for more cool stuff at barpatrol.net. Come join our bar and restaurant mastermind Facebook group. I appreciate you being here. I am going to see you next time. I am out.